Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, January 27th, 2024. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, we're going to hear a special message from our own treasure trove of knowledge, the walking library, the Sultan of Study, Dr. Gerald Horne, who's reminding you where you want to be next weekend, February 3rd. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by John Garrigus, professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington, and for our purposes today, author of the book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. This will be some historical knowledge that you definitely will not want to miss. Finally, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Arielle Xena Alterwaite, Ph.D. candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She's currently writing her dissertation on how Haiti was forced to pay reparations to their former enslavers, thereby dooming their economy for generations. Stay tuned right here on Freedom Now. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and KPFK.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Grover Washington Jr., Art Blakey, John Coltrane, Tommy Flanagan, Chin Chin Lu, and Gregory Tardy. Now people get ready for this train to come in, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a special message from Dr. Gerald Horne and an interview with John Garrigus.
We have not met at this great Congress of African people to discuss unity with white people. That is not our problem today. Our problem and the gravest problem facing black people today is the unity of all black men the world over.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. We present this calendar to put into context the present struggle against the three evil paradigms of oppression: national oppression, what many call racism; class oppression, what many call poverty; and gender oppression, what many call sexism. It is through reviewing the history of our struggles that we gain added momentum in the ideological wars against the three evil pillars of capitalism and imperialism. February 1st, 1898. Queen Mother Moore, an African sister activist in the U.S., was born. She was an early organizer of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Later, in 1933, she joined the Communist Party due to its program of supporting the establishment of the Black nation in the 5 state areas of the South. She was a prolific organizer of domestic workers, tenants, and women in Harlem. She was a founding member of the National Council of Negro Women, as well as the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. In 1962, she joined the Reparations Committee of Descendants of U.S. slaves. She passed away at the age of 98. Alafia. January 31st, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish chattel slavery was established. January 31st, 1901 to 1974. Francine Bernard of Azania, warrior queen, was born. She was a leader of the African National Congress, the leading liberation movement in the struggle against apartheid. She was a teacher, domestic worker, and trade union leader, considered the Fannie Lou Hamer of Azania, South Africa. She led the Pass Law revolts and was imprisoned and eventually banished from South Africa in 1969. February 1st, 1960. 4 African students initiated the second phase of the civil rights movement in the student sit-ins at the Woolworths department store in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. The students attempted to order a hamburger and were beaten and jailed by the whites for challenging the segregation laws. The following day, 23 brothers from A&T and 4 sisters from Bennett College returned to the department store facing the same punishment. Before the end of the semester, over 6,000 students from over 78 southern campuses had sat in, and over 2,000 had not only gone to jail, but were brutally beaten by the racist Southern police. Within 1 year, over 70,000 young people, mainly Africans, staged sit-ins throughout the South. February 2nd, 1848. The first draft of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded Mexican land to the United States. Subsequently, every provision of the agreement between Mexico and United States was violated by the United States. February 3rd, 1969. Eduardo Mondiane, founder-president of Frelimo, Front of the Liberation of Mozambique, was assassinated. Frelimo was the vanguard movement in the decolonization struggle against Portuguese colonialism. February 3rd, 1930. Vietnamese Communist Party founder by Ho Chi Minh and the Revolutionary Intelligentsia of Vietnam to liberate Vietnam from French and later U.S. colonial forces. The Vietnamese Communist Party continues today to provide a higher quality of life under socialism then under the French and U.S. colonial rule in critical areas of education, childcare, health, food, and housing. February 4th, 1969. Movimento for the Liberation of Angola begins armed struggle against the Portuguese colonialists. February 6, 1945. Bob Marley was born. The reggae superstar who during the period of depoliticization of music with the corporate-created disco craze brought reggae to the masses of humanity as a musical ideological weapon whose lyrical content affirmed African history, decolonization movements, black pride, love, and unity amongst many other themes. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. For more information, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. We end this section with our revolutionary chant from Azania, South Africa. Amandla, awetu, Amandla, awetu, Amandla, awetu.
Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. We're hosting a fundraiser for the station on Saturday, February 3rd from 1 to 3 in Africatown, Leimert Park. Visit kpfk.org or my Facebook page for details. All, and I do mean all, proceeds go to your favorite radio station. This is your opportunity to make a statement that you appreciate what we have been doing on the air for years in presenting a Pan-Africanist and internationalist viewpoint. Thus, Freedom Now has been in the vanguard of trumpeting the profundity and importance of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse, including in the USA. More than this, Freedom Now has stressed that when this unpaid sector of the working class broke the chains of oppression, the entire working class, including those who received wages, benefited and benefit to this very day. Thus, if you were a member of a union or received wages as a postal worker or a truck driver or hotel worker or hospital worker or nurse or janitor or teacher, you must attend our fundraiser for KPFK, which is one way to repay the enormous debt owed to those of us who uplift the Haitian Revolution. Freedom Now also has stressed the importance of the Cuban Revolution, 1959, which occurred as U.S. imperialism was forced to retreat from the more hard aspects of U.S. apartheid or Jim Crow. The Cuban government then sent troops to Southern Africa to liberate that region from the pestilence of apartheid. And in the last week or so, the South African government not only has brought suit against Israeli war criminals at the International Court of Justice, but of late has joined the United States and UK governments as aiders and abettors of genocide in Gaza, which has enormous implication for our own effort in the international community to gain support for our just struggle for reparations. If you support the South African case at the International Court of Justice against Israeli genocide in Gaza, you must come to our KPFK fundraiser on February 3rd. If you want to understand how it was that South Africa, out of all the nations in the world, chose to drag Israel into the dock, you must pick up an inscribed copy of my book on Southern Africa for your own edification or as a donation to a school library. Thus, if you oppose wage theft, an analog to the unpaid labor that beset so many before 1865, which continues to exist, speaking of wage theft, then you must attend our fundraiser for KPFK on February 3rd, which is one way to repay the enormous debt owed to those of us who uplift the Cuban Revolution. You can also pick up an inscribed copy of my books on the Haitian Revolution and Cuban Revolution for your own edification or as a donation to a school library. But that's not all. There is good reason for even those in the mainstream to discuss impending U.S. fascism. Unfortunately, however, this is often ascribed solely to the presence of a charismatic individual, speaking of Agent Orange, as opposed to the machinations of a system in crisis that has generated mass support for fascism. At least not unusual in a settler colonial society based upon genocide against the indigenous and mass enslavement of Africans and class collaboration between and amongst descendants of the original European settlers. It's not unusual for fascism to arise in such a setting. At this fundraiser, you can also pick up an inscribed copy of my books on the roots of fascism in the United States, as embodied in Texas, where the Old South met the Wild West. And as well, an exploration of the last occasion when this nation confronted fascism directly in the 1930s, when the intellectual leader of this trend was a light-skinned Negro, Lawrence Dennis, who was, quote, passing for white, unquote. At this fundraiser, you can also pick up an inscribed copy of my book on Lawrence Dennis and fascism, which really needs to be adapted for stage and screen. So, be there or be square. Run, don't walk, to Lemert Park, February 3rd, 1 to 3 p.m. Details at kpfk.org or my Facebook page. This has been Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles. For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is John Garrigus, professor of history at the University of Texas in Arlington, and author of the book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Garrigus.
Thank you very much, Professor Horne. I'm so delighted to have a chance to talk to you about this project.
Ditto. We are delighted to have you. So why did you write this book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks?
Well, this is the book that I've always wanted to write and which I assumed could not be written. I assumed there weren't sources. I didn't think you could tell the story of individual enslaved people and show the connection between their actions and the Haitian Revolution of August 1791. And so I wrote a number of other books on Saint-Domingue where I knew I could find documentation, most notably on the free population of color of that island. And then I started to work on the so-called Great Poisoning of Conspiracy, complete misnomer. And I began looking at the testimonies generated by that quote-unquote conspiracy, and I began to discover the extraordinary stories of individual men and women and their resistance activities. And I was able to show how those activities fed into the Haitian Revolution that started just south of Cape Haitian, the modern day city.
So what was the so-called Great Poisoning Conspiracy? And by the way, who was Mackandal?
Well, yeah, Mackandal is the name that we've associated with the Great Poison Conspiracy. And the Poison Conspiracy in Saint-Domingue for a long time has been regarded as the only successful, the only example of slave resistance against French colonization in French Saint-Domingue or colonial Haiti. And I started to take a look at that because it's always been, historians have called it a paradox. Why is the only successful slave revolution have no history of violence against enslavers except for the Mackandal poison conspiracy? Yet when I began to look at that, it simply didn't make sense. Mackandal was an African man, probably from the Congo, arrested in 1758 after tens of thousands of people were dying in the North Province of the colony. And yet when you look at the identity of those people, 90% of them were enslaved Black people. And Mackandal had escaped slavery, and colonists and other historians have portrayed him as a revolutionary. Even the great C.L.R. James talked about him as a Trotskyist. And yet the idea that Mackandal was striking at the plantation system by killing other enslaved people to strike at the mode of production, let's say, just did not make sense to me. And so I began looking at his testimony and discovered that, in fact, colonists were unable to show that in any way he was involved in making medicines or poisons of any kind. And so his conviction and execution as a murderer, as a resistor, as a revolutionary, was incorrect in the sense of him being a poisoner. He was a resistor, though, and he was someone who is intimately linked to the Haitian Revolution that started 30 years later.
How was he a resistor?
What Mackandal did that frightened the colonists so badly was that he created a spiritual community based on Congo spiritual practices involving power objects. In the colony, these were known as Mackandal, but anthropologists and people in the Congo region of Africa might call them Minkisi or Inkisi in the singular. And they were bundles, living bundles that believers felt could protect them from evil and predict the future. And in fact, Mackandal was living in a time of extraordinary evil and death. He wasn't causing that death. He was using his Inkisi to protect his followers against the death, the mysterious death. They were intensely loyal to him, and that was deeply frightening to the colonists, which was why he had to be executed.
Now, setting aside the so-called Great Poison Conspiracy, what was the role, if any, of poisons and ethnobotany in resistance to enslavement in this site?
Well, it's a really interesting question. So I'll only start with the answer that I proposed to what was the great killer that Mackandal and hundreds of other people were blamed for, and it was a disease imported from France. Bacteria known as anthrax today that acts very rapidly on animals primarily, and then on the humans that work with or eat the flesh of those animals. It can kill a person or an animal within 24 to 48 hours. The symptoms are extremely painful but quite generic, and healthy people and healthy livestock literally lie down and die in extraordinary pain. So enslaved people were driven to eat the flesh of those animals because the French colonists systematically undernourished them. Saint-Domingue worked enslaved people to death, the colonists did, but they also worked animals to death. And so there was not only a massive trade in enslaved people, but a massive trade in animals coming from Venezuela and all over the Caribbean. And the disease was probably brought in from French Louisiana. And enslaved people also were the ones who worked most closely with livestock. So I found a number of cases where enslaved people clearly understood that in the plants and animal flesh that came out of these mysterious deaths, they had a powerful poison. But I really did not find much evidence that they were systematically using that poison against their enslavers. One case that I mentioned in the book, but clearly they did possess this extraordinary toxin.
Mm-hmm. So what was the role of gender during this period?
Well, I found that both men and women were involved in these resistance communities, and I should say that I found 4 different types of resistance activities as I traced the stories of these men and women who were tortured and executed as poisoners. So I found a woman whose son was accused of being a poisoner who used the French law courts of course, ineffectively, because the law courts were totally stacked against enslaved people. But she understood that the letter of the law offered protection against the kind of persecution her son was undergoing. And another group of men and women who were being tortured by their enslaver as poisoners, again, also turned ineffectively but courageously to the French law system. Women were also very important in the communities that gathered around spiritual leaders like Mackandal. He had a wife, a woman, the sources say, named Brigitte, who had the same powers that he did. And then about 20 years after Mackandal, in the very same region, a woman named Kingay, who was also from the Congo, also emerged as somebody who could protect people against the mysterious poisons that no one really still understood at that time. So both men and women were involved. Violence was involved, but there was a lot of other resistance activity that was really designed to protect people from the extraordinary suffering caused not only by the slave system, which was terrible enough, but by this mysterious wave of deaths and then the persecutions on top of that.
Now, you've mentioned Congo a couple of times. Should I infer that either the enslaved population was disproportionately comprised of Congolese, or that Congolese were disproportionately involved in resistance?
Well, Mackandal has been identified as coming from a variety of different African places, and I think historians have really sort of focused now and really believe, based on linguistic evidence and the spiritual evidence, that he was from the Congo River Basin. He was not a Muslim from Northwest Africa or from Western Africa, and yet so he was an extremely important resistance fighter. And yes, by the 1780s, the majority of enslaved people being trafficked into the Saint-Domingue were from that Congo region of Africa. And yet there were people in an earlier period, a man named Medor, who described a kind of a secret among the blacks that I talk about in the book. He was clearly from West Africa, and the people who worked with him in a number of courageous resistance activities were also clearly from that same West African region. So really all kinds of people using all kinds of techniques were fighting slavery on the eve of the Haitian Revolution.
Speaking of which, what was the role of striking and or labor stoppages during this period?
Well, it's one of the extraordinary things I found, and it's actually other historians, David Garrigus is one of the many people who've documented, but haven't really underlined, that enslaved workers on sugar plantations understood that they were in a profit-making enterprise that was pushing them to the utmost so that their managers and owners could make money. And they understood that walking off the plantation could stop that flow of profit and endanger the whole harvest year. And so I found evidence of 8 different strikes in the region, labor strikes in the 1780s in the region where the Haitian Revolution broke out. And those were also the same places where anthrax had struck, killing animals, killing enslaved people, who then were often blamed for those deaths. So labor strikes, I think, were another way that people could push back against the capitalist system that made Saint-Domingue such a profit center for France and for the colonists in the island.
What was the role, if any, of murder?
Everybody I looked at, all these people accused of poison were all, of course, accused of murder. And I did find, of the maybe a dozen people, 2 or 3 who confessed, of course, under torture, to murdering their enslavers. But one of the insights I had working for 30 years on this field is that when an enslaved person is trying to get manumitted, at least in this particular society, they're trying to get their enslaver to see them as a human being. And we were often successful, but if they murdered the person, this is what colonists thought was happening. They were being murdered all the time so that slaves could become free. But if they murdered their enslaver, the person who then became their new enslaver would be an attorney or an accountant who would regard the enslaved person as just another piece of capital. And so it didn't really make sense for people to say poison their enslaver to death. What made much more sense was for them to give African medicines or use African spiritual techniques to create a stronger bond between the enslaver and the enslaved. And so I think planners thought they were being poisoned to death, but really they were being poisoned as part of a negotiation process in which enslaved people hoped would lead to their freedom.
Mm-hmm. And what was the role of the free colored class during this period?
Yeah, that's a really important point and a kind of a complicated one because, of course, in the United States, we call all free people in the slave period who have African descent, we call everybody free blacks because of the way American racism operates. However, in the Caribbean, as of course you know, Dr. Horne, there was a large population of biracial people, as numerous as the white population, and those biracial people I'm talking about were born in freedom, and many of them were enslavers, and a few were actually quite wealthy. So they were not free blacks, but their attempts to get citizenship in the early French Revolution indicated that whites were not going to budge on the racial divide between white and quote unquote non-white in the colony, and that I argue was helped push the enslaved people to take the courageous step of launching the revolution. Another group, though, that we could also call free people of color were formerly enslaved people who had gotten manumission or freedom. Toussaint Louverture, of course, was one of these people free when the revolution broke out. So those people were not enslavers necessarily. Many of them were closely tied to enslaved people through their family networks and religious networks. And they were really important in spreading the word of the revolution. And many people believe that Toussaint Louverture may have been orchestrating the revolution, even though he only emerged as a leader several years into the event.
Finally, Professor Garrigus, Professor of History, University of Texas, Arlington, author of the book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. What's next on your research and book writing agenda?
Well, you know, this book, I think is unlike anything I've ever written or probably will write in the future, right? It's a book about people. It's based on a lot of deep archival work, but it was a book that I worked really hard to write so that people would see the other human beings who were caught in slavery and who brought about the Haitian Revolution. So it's a book that's not written for professors, though I think they'll get a lot out of it. It's a book written for ordinary people who are interested in the story of revolution and Haiti and the African American experience sort of broadly defined. So after writing this book, I'm going to go back and work on some more technical issues. I'm really interested in some of the neighborhoods in Saint-Domingue that produced leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture, and using parish records and these kind of, very arcane historical sources to try and shed some light on the lives of these, not just these famous people, but their families and the relationships that they had with people in slavery and people in freedom. So I'm going to keep focusing on people and the years before the Haitian Revolution, but I don't think I'll ever write anything that has been as satisfying to write, and I hope as satisfying to read as this book, A Secret Among the Blacks.
What would you expect to find about Dessalines and Toussaint in these parish records, for example?
Well, both of those men, Toussaint rented property after he was free in this region called Grand Riviere, where Dessalines was enslaved. And in fact, we believe that Dessalines may, for a while, have been enslaved under Toussaint. Toussaint leased some workers, and Dessalines seems like he was one of those people. Grand Riviere produced an extraordinary amount of revolutionary leaders. It was a place known as the home of free blacks, not free people not free biracial people, but ex-slaves. So it's kind of an extraordinary place, and I'm really curious, what were the conditions there? There were colonists there. What were the relationships among white people and black people in slavery and in freedom in that extraordinary place, which seemed to produce such a cadre of leaders? So if I can find records of baptisms and deaths and God parentage, that will help me shed some light on the networks that people were building before the revolution broke out.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Garrigus, author of the book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. It is now time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined by Arielle Alterwaite. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Arielle Xena Alterwaite, Ph.D. candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, now writing a dissertation on how Haiti was forced in 1825 to pay an indemnity, other words, reparations, to their former enslavers, which crippled the economy for decades to come. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Alterwaite.
Thank you so much for Professor Horne for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So outline for our audience your argument and thesis.
So first, just to provide a bit more background on what the 1825 Haitian Indemnity actually was for listeners. So at the end of the 18th century, Haiti was a French plantation colony called Saint-Domingue. But in 1791, free people of color and enslaved people of African descent on the island rise up against the French in what we now call the Haitian Revolution. And the successes of that revolution lead to an 1804 Declaration of Independence and the abolition of slavery within Haitian borders by Black Haitians. However, it's not until 2 decades later, in 1825, that France decided to recognize Haitian independence, and they do so in a treaty that demanded 2 things: both free trading privileges between Haiti and France, and a payment of 150 million francs in reparations to French plantation owners. And this amount is roughly equivalent to over $20 billion in today's currency. And Haiti is immediately tasked with securing an international loan to finance the debt. And this resulting Haitian indemnity debt therefore obligates the new nation not only to the French treasury, but also to independent financial institutions. And this is a topic that has received a lot of scholarly and journalistic attention in recent years, including most recently by the New York Times. But for me, the question has always remained actually why and how this happened and the mechanics behind it. And no one has really tried to link so far the financial instruments and the actors who develop them to see how the debt is both shaped by and also shaped at a key historical moment when major ideas around sovereignty, abolition, emancipation, finance, and commercial exchange are all undergoing major transformations across the Atlantic world. So in order to start answering the sets of questions I have of just how did this debt come to be, how did it work in practice, how did it destitute Haitians, who was profiting off of it, I went to trace the money in the archives so I could see the debt and how it played out in the lives of lots of different people. And so I've done at this point now research in archives in 7 different nations, and you have British bankers in London, French middle-class bondholders in provincial cities, then you have the madansara in Haiti, which is the Creole word for market women, and you also have people like Greek revolutionaries who were living in exile in Paris at the time, who were all somehow imbricated with this debt. And by bringing all these actors together, my project really looks at the way in which finance created informal imperialism after abolition to create a system that was in many ways more profitable for private banks than slavery. And so you can see how a post-abolitionist Atlantic world creates the financing of the debt. And I guess one set of archives I use that other historians haven't is looking at the Archivo General de la Nación in Santo Domingo, which at the time is a part of the Haitian Empire, or you have also Haitian Ministry of Finance records in the Boston Public Library. And in those cases, you can see how this debt affected the lives of Haitians in terms of the forms of currencies they used. But there was also a lot of resistance to the debt in looking at it as well, where sort of Haitians are not using the French currency system at the time, and they're trading in Haiti's national currency, which is a paper bill system, which is actually very successful and widely traded. But overall, that's just one specific example. But really, in this broader story, where you have something like the 150 million francs owed by Haiti to French planters, which is a very abstract, large sovereign debt, but you can ground it in the concrete realities of political economy, the lives of everyday people, and see how it wasn't just the debt that was the full problem, but it's precisely how new notions of finance and banking built in this charged aftermath of post-colonial restructuring and the abolition of slavery created informal imperial structures that made it impossible for Haitians to ever be able to pay off the debt. So therefore, and this obviously has very strong implications for the present, since it's not only the debt, but it's the constant maneuvering around the payment of the debt that then becomes the foundation of our contemporary banking systems. You have banks like CIC, Crédit Industriel, which is based out of France, or then you have Citibank based out of New York, which all profited at some point and continue to do so around Haitian debt. And so these banks are active participants in this debate around global inequality, and then the question of reparations in Haiti becomes a central feature.
So was there opposition either in France or in Haiti to this so-called indemnity of 1825?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it's very interesting how across the political spectrum, you get different forms of opposition to the debt. So in France, you actually have a lot of opposition to the debt by French planters who don't see a lot of those reparations payments, because those payments are going straight into private banks that issue the loans and then eventually out to bondholders. But so planters are actually writing and petitioning to the French state, complaining about the fact that this indemnity is taking place, and also that it's actually not more money, because the 150 million franc amount is calculated based on 1 year of exports that the colony of Saint-Domingue had produced in profits, but is actually not calculated based on repairing planters in land or in the value of enslaved people that they held as property. So planters are not happy with the indemnity. And then, of course, there are many other people who are not happy with the indemnity as well, including Haitians, who then there's certain instances throughout the moments when Haiti would send boxes of coins because France said, no, you can't send coffee to pay off the debt. You can't send Haitian paper money to pay off the debt. Have to send specie, gold and silver coinage. And you have instances where Haitians will try to conduct raids on those shipments. And that I would consider to be a form of protest, right? In terms of like trying to block those shipments from getting sent across the Atlantic. And then you have various sources, like there's a huge important political economy intellectual tradition that's growing out of Haiti at this time of Haitian authors who are also against the debt in terms of its principles of a sort of form of neocolonialism that's operating. And then, so there's a lot of written work too that's creating then a form of intellectual exchange that's extending out of Haiti, but then also African Americans in the US are monitoring this intensely. And also there's a dialogue that's formed there as well, which I think one can track then into broader sort of critiques of colonialism that persist to this day.
So I infer from what you're saying, that is to say that the planters in France were oftentimes opposed, yet this new system, post-1825, I thought I heard you say that it was even more profitable than slavery itself. Can we then infer that in some ways this was a blow against one sector of the ruling class, speaking of the planters, in favor of another sector, speaking of bankers and finance capital?
Absolutely. And then this is a case too where you see how bankers, finance capital are in conversation with liberal abolitionists at the time and are actually then using Haitian sovereignty to create themselves as sub-sovereign bodies within the French legal system. So, and what I mean by this, and this is how I actually first got interested in the topic, because I remember reading about how, learning about the Haitian Revolution and then learning, okay, France doesn't recognize Haitian sovereignty until 2 decades later, and how that was completely hinged upon a debt agreement. But French abolitionists were in support of this massive debt payment. So I was like, what is behind this? And they're all liberals, and they're all very much in favor of the fact that, okay, lauding the Black nation of Haiti, but then at the same time, completely okay with the fact that Haiti is being bound in financial chains. And in that sense, it is where you can have at the same time liberals and bankers saying this is such a great thing that Haiti is sovereign, absolutely, we can applaud this, while then they're profiting financially off of that very system.
So are you suggesting then that some of the French abolitionists were basically paid off by finance capital, were in bed with finance capital, or were they just engaged in blinkered thinking?
I think the ways in which a lot of these abolitionists are the bankers themselves. So in that sense, they're profiting off of the system. Direct payments are not always fully happening, but so one person I study in my work is the abolitionist. His name is the Abbé Gregoire, and he's kind of lauded as the Thomas Clarkson of like the French world in some ways. And he's someone who is very much in favor of Haitian sovereignty. On paper, he's against the indemnity, so he's not fully a liberal, like he is critical of it. But then he's someone where when the Haitian state sends him coffee as a sort of thank you for his work in promoting like the case of Haitian sovereignty in France, the Abbé Gregoire then has to send that coffee and have it held by one of the very same banks which issues Haitian bonds. And that bank then sells the coffee, so then Abbé Gregoire can have like cash just to use in his daily life. But in that way, it's just kind of the way the system is structured, it becomes unavoidable to not support the system. So questions of intentionality, of course, are kind of difficult to tease out in some ways. But the point is that it is a system that's being built at that point of time where Haiti does not have the luxury of remaining an island, and the ways in which people profit off of it within the system continue to grow and snowball.
Switching gears for a second, I understand you've also done research on enslaved women's medical knowledge in pre-revolutionary Haiti and the commodification of same. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's not totally a separate topic in the sense that it's very interested because we know about Saint-Domingue as a plantation colony and the ways in which plantations produce sugar, they produce coffee. Also, Saint-Domingue itself was a major site of the slave trade where French slavers would bring enslaved people and then sell them to Spanish, Portuguese, and later US slavers. So those profit systems were very apparent to me, and I was curious though about other forms of the commodification and profiteering that were going on, and in this, which is what drew me to the project about how you have enslaved women on plantations who have medical expertise, who are working towards a project where they are providing care in communities in the form of, say, midwifery and allowing enslaved women to give birth and not die, but then how they're using different cures and different plants with which to do so that are coming from West Africa or then are being developed. So there's a form of like very strong intellectual expertise there. And so then you have all these plantation doctors not only wanting to learn and appropriate that knowledge so that more slaves can be born on plantations, but then also to take that knowledge and perhaps hawk it as a medical cure back in France. And so this is just another form in which the plantation complex was very profitable, but then also which relates in some ways to the project I'm working on now, because of course, again, you have coffee and sugar that's being exported from Saint-Domingue, but you also have as a major site, a lot of silver is exiting out of Saint-Domingue as a result of the slave trade. So part of the indemnity then too is just about, okay, France is no longer having that major sort of cash flow after the Haitian Revolution. And so looking then at the indemnity as a way of trying to rectify that deficit.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Alterwaite, Ph.D. candidate in history, University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, writing a dissertation on how Haiti was forced in 1825 to pay an indemnity, in other words, reparations to the former enslavers in France, which crippled the economy for decades to come. What's the timetable for your finishing this project? And also, are there any articles that you can point our audience to that could be further enlightening?
So the timetable for the project is that so it's part of my dissertation, which will be finished in a year. I'm working right now on finalizing an article on the question of Haitian money. So Haiti's own currency and money in Haiti, which is something that hasn't been discussed in terms of incorporating Haiti into broader conversations about monetary systems at this time. But I think, though, for listeners, one thing I would definitely recommend that they look at your book, Confronting the Black Jacobins, because in that book, it's one of the only ones that sort of works on this topic that really relates Haiti to broader developments in the world at the time, and sort of resists this idea and pays attention to the ways Haiti is both exceptional, but then also the possibilities for relating Haiti to other places, because that is what is so important for building solidarity. And I think even just with my own work, like I'm really interested in this question of, for example, like, okay, you have at the same time as Haiti's becoming independent, Greece is becoming independent. Haiti is the first nation that recognizes Greece's sovereignty. You also have Latin American states becoming independent. And that's a case where the US completely blocks any potential solidarity with the 1826 Congress of Panama. And so in order for listeners to kind of understand how possibilities are shut down and the mechanics behind them, I would just recommend your book as a starting place.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Alterwaite, Ph.D. candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
You don't have a peaceful revolution. You don't have a turn the other cheek revolution. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Only kind of revolution that's nonviolent is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution based on loving your enemy is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter, a desegregated theater, a desegregated park, and a desegregated public toilets. You can sit down next to white folks on the toilet. That's no revolution. Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with John Garrigus from the University of Texas at Arlington. Find a Black-owned bookstore near you and get his book, A Secret Amongst the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. Next up, we thank Arielle Xena Alterwaite, Ph.D. candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Didan Kavati. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you listeners out there. You are the supporters that keep this village a-moving. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk, or go to the audio archives on kpfk.org and scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.